Hello, beautiful community. Our question today is from Fran from Australia, and it's what's the state of the left and the real left, not just the center left, in our world? And what's the relation of the left to all the scary crises that we face? So let's take Fran's question. Could you please tell us more about what you think about the left now? I mean, the real left, including the Bernie Sanders version. I'm leaning toward Western socialism and becoming more of a hawk with every day that the brutal invasion of Ukraine continues. I'm also desperate for solutions to the climate crisis, but I don't want to sacrifice democracy in the process or kick people with real potentially useful ideas out of the movement. Thanks so much for what you do, Fran from Australia. Fran, thank you so much for your question. I think it's really beautifully and healthily put. And it's always heartwarming to interact with the Australian members of the community. As everybody knows, I've spent a lot of time in Australia, and it's a part of the world where I feel physically freest, actually, whereas I feel culturally freest in Central Europe, probably. So it's a pleasure. And I've read your question. I've jotted down just 4 or 5 keywords to help us have a little chat. So let's make a go of this. We could be here for 20 minutes and we could get a bit workshoppy. Now, I think that's justified because we're talking about a really important topic that I didn't want to put into one of the bigger long-form Q&As that are coming up as soon as my health allows me to get out of the countryside and back to London. We'll do all that. So we are living through a very big crisis of trust in public institutions. As you know, I think it's the biggest trust crisis in politics since the European revolutions of 1848. We're living through a realignment of the role of the United States in the world as big as anything since 1945. And we're living through a big knock for political liberalism that's, in transformational terms, as big as 1989, but just in reverse. And when I wrote something like that on social media earlier, somebody said, you're exaggerating. Of course, I'm not. Because I'm not saying we've got the biggest crisis of any kind on our hands. We don't by any means have that. We had worse crises in the 20th century. But specifically in these 3 respects, we've got issues. And against the background of this, we've got a situation where the center-right, the center, and the center-left, about which we often talk, have not just run out of ideas, they've run out of a capacity to put together a liberatory vision for the country, whatever country you're in. You know, here's the vision for who we are and how we're going into a better future. And 3, they've lost connection with majorities in whatever countries you care to name. Not everywhere, but tendentiously, this is a pattern, and it's true in most places now. In the UK, we have a very big majority for a centrist government, but it's a very thin reality, actually, because Labour's majority in the UK is huge, but it's also not likely, but possible that this could be the last Labour government in the history of British politics. Right? These are the transformational currents we're living through. And at the same time, as we've got a sort of a prominent centre-left in very severe decay, we have a kind of quite extraordinary absence of the left-left. And people often talk about the left being here and the left being there, but almost invariably when you look to a place that the left is said to be, it's not there. And of course, we've discussed many times how it isn't my recommendation to remotely associate hyper-identity politics with leftism. It's a perversion of liberalism. So it's not possible to say that insofar as hyper-identity politics has gone nuts on campuses, that the campuses are left. They're not. They are not. If you're seriously left, you are isolated on a British campus or on an American campus, you know? So this idea that the left is everywhere is nonsense. The left is virtually completely absent from our political lives, but the left is a very important set of Western traditions. So important that we can't sort of wish them away even if we wanted to. They're part of who we are, even if our politics doesn't incorporate them now. So without talking about this, you can't even understand who you are, even if you are very right-wing. And that's, I think, what is the first thing I want to say, Fran, that you're not in a cult. You're not in a group of sort of freaks who take a minority position. You are part of a central current of Western culture. That's to say, don't be fearful, right, about ideologically about what's behind your back. You've got a lot behind your back. You've got a lot of rich resources, a lot of images, a lot of history. And I kind of say that to any ideological tradition. I say that to conservatives too. You know, be bold about what you've got behind your back. Don't be timid. Be bold, be open, be loving, be proud. So let's just begin putting a few things on the table. And of course, I do want to touch specifically on climate and the key issues you're worried about. One important point is the concept of revolution in socialist thought. And you don't have to take that idea literally. You don't have to talk about it in terms of a revolution that you think is going to occur 17 Tuesdays from now. When you think about revolution in that tradition, a tradition that isn't mine, that is alien to me, so this conversation is to a degree just about all of us being, inheritors of these important threads in our culture, but it's also partly just an act of imaginative empathy on my part. And I'll tell you a bit about my relationship to the left at the end, if you like. So the idea of revolution is just the idea that not all good causes are socialist causes, because socialist causes are not just the causes of righteous groups, they're the causes of righteous groups that can effectively achieve societal transformation. And I'm not saying you have to go in for that, but I'm saying it's an important question to think about. It's an important issue. How do you relate to revolutionary transformation? And so there's a kind of a risk of thinking that all just causes are not just causes you care about, but are distinctly socialist causes. And I think you can get to that place with a kind of a moralized picture of socialism. But if you want to be more politically realistic and you want to be a socialist, you're sort of pushed into thinking about whether one group is going to be a more effective vehicle of societal transformation than another. But whether one group is fighting for societal transformation generally versus another group that's just fighting for its own rights, and once it gets those, it's not interested in broader societal transformation. So that's just one idea that I want to put on the table, one of my buzzwords. I suppose here we could mention the strangeness of the thing that you've put down in your question, which I very much relate to, that you're supporting the United States support for Ukraine very strongly. And of course, what we're doing there is we are supporting a pretty neoliberal, arguably, empire, backing an even more neoliberal and to a degree hyper-neoliberal fledgling democracy. Ukraine vehemently does not share two of the central elements of Putinism in its political culture. It doesn't share the fascism, it doesn't share the mysticism, but at the level of neoliberalism and hyper-neoliberalism, there's quite a bit of overlap. So hyper-neoliberalism isn't just a neoliberal notion that you put you emphasize the primacy of the market in a magical way, but that you just equate market competition with just any conflict, and you sort of have a risk of a picture of society where it's anyone's out to get anybody else, and that's all you can really get, all you can really hope for, and that's okay. So how does a socialist get herself into that cause? And I would say quite naturally. I think it's probably a good position to take, and I share it. My second buzzword is, of course, climate, and we've got two sort of big democratic climate-related headaches. The first headache is that as a climate alarmist, but not an extreme climate alarmist, I see, at least in the West, the climate crisis as threatening the survival of democracy, but not threatening the survival of civilization. I do not see climate-mediated civilizational collapse in the West by 2100. But I do see quite a bit of climate-mediated democratic collapse in the West by 2100. So that's one thing that I think worries us. The second thing that worries us is that the kinds of policies Western countries would need to take if they were to address the climate crisis more seriously are not policies that are galvanizing any civic consent anywhere. So you've got a situation where the more you do good stuff for the climate, the more you undermine your democracy. And that's a very tough knot that we're in. But what do you do as a socialist? How do you engage with the climate issue? And I think that one of the big questions for anybody on the proper left is, where do you stand on growth and degrowth? And I think it's a really important separate conversation. I'm not going to go too much in depth into it, except if you like, I can make a frivolous recommendation, which is I think we should get beyond that debate. And in many ways, it's got too fetishistic and ideological and algorithmically driven, and that we should look at common values and principles that get us in a piecemeal way out of being on the growth or on the degrowth side. And I think that I think that a socialist has very special reason to think about this issue. So I think it's something that I think you're forced to take a view on. Perhaps we could talk about it a bit more. And I think that the other buzzword that I've put here is, where do you come from? A phrase, buzz phrase. And I think that's very, very important to how you understand your socialism. And there are very many rich traditions, from quite hard Marxian social analysis to 19th century socialist utopianism, to certain Catholic traditions, to certain anarchist anti-authoritarian traditions that might have a say that really has weight for you historically. Funnily enough, 19th century Russia offers quite a bit of resource for that. And of course, then there is a tradition of socialist thought that's not a tradition, but is a tradition. And what I mean by that is it's minimally ideological. So if you take somebody like George Orwell, for instance, his socialism is almost artistically, ideologically minimal. It doesn't run through many traditions of ideas. It's him looking at the slums in Paris and reacting to them viscerally, and then arriving at certain principles and ideas about how society might be organized. So there is also this kind of, it's still ideological because you're swimming about with beliefs and images about how society works, but it's ideological with a smaller I, and with many fewer ideas there, many fewer big ideas, just viscerally reacting to the world. There are other ways of getting to socialism. For instance, some people have got there just through an account of human nature. They think, well, given 17 truths about human nature, the least worst society to have, even if we can't have it, would be something like XYZ. There is also that. And I think that just exploring that and finding the you in that, what speaks to you most powerfully, is important. It's a very important part of the sort of, authenticity of political self-realization. And it's something that's always an open conversation, whether you're 19 or 90. Always exploring where your, socialism comes from. Let's see what other buzzword I've written down. Oh, yes. And we're going to get to a few practical suggestions at the end, of course. But another issue is conflict of values. Now, it can be natural for left and socialist traditions to take the anti-pluralist view that I don't share, that you can reconcile core political values, that once you properly understand, for instance, freedom and equality, you'll see that they don't clash. Or that once you properly understand the many different kinds of equalities, you'll see that they don't clash. You can arrange our concerns around the different kinds of equalities that matter to us into some kind of a package where they don't tragically get in each other's way. And of course, as a pluralist, I think that such reconciliation is a political and a philosophical mistake. But I'd encourage you to richly disagree with me if that's where you want to go. So that's a very important question for any socialist, right? What do you think about the big societal goods, justice, equality, liberty? Do they all go together, or do you accept a pluralistic story about constitutive conflict? Now, of course, what Marx would say about that is that actually, yes, there is the conflict, and that yes, it is insoluble in this political order. But given the societal transformation that may or will occur, we can get beyond these conflicts of values in the next world. So unlike somebody like Rousseau, who wants to say we can dissolve value conflict here and now, or unlike a certain version of Kant, who wants to say we can't resolve the conflict, but we can somehow adjudicate the way we balance it in accordance with certain principles of right and justice in this world. Marx says, no, neither of these are possible. So Marx would take the pluralist view, if you like, in this world, but then he would say that there's a certain story of societal transformation that can get us beyond conflict. My next buzzword is a double buzzword: alienation and exploitation. And I think it's very important, for a socialist to reflect deeply on the place of alienation. And I think that one thing that would perhaps distinguish a socialist from me is that while I'm enormously serious about class and enormously serious about inequality, economic inequality and exclusion, I am not so big on attributing most of the alienation in the world to that. I'm big on attributing most of the alienation we feel actually to features of the modern world, the disenchanted nature of modernity. But I think the more left you are, the more you probably want to say, hang on, a lot of our alienation is more solvable than we think. And it's to do with various kinds of economic relations and modes of exclusion. And I tend to think that we've got a huge problem with that, but that if we could solve it better, it wouldn't take care of as much of the alienation as somebody on the proper left might think. And the other word is exploitation. And I think that the simple question here are which capitalist relationships are exploitative, right? So all of them? I bet you don't think that. I bet you don't think that when you go into a family-run coffee shop on the corner near where you are, and they make you a beautiful oat cappuccino, that they're exploiting you, you're exploiting them. Maybe you could think that a little bit. Where does exploitation end? Where does it begin? What's the space for relationships of mutual advantage, mutual benefit in capitalist exchange? Now, here I come to a couple of practical buzzwords. Where do you take all of this stuff that could seem to a lot of people fluffy that I've put on the table? I think the first buzzword I have is institutional reform and local politics. Like you, Fran, I am worried about thinking that it's a good idea to give up on our flailing democratic institutions just because they're bad and they're delivering us either, ineffectual politics, like the Kamala Harris ticket, or Trump. But there's an enormous space for democratic regeneration, for democratization of the public spaces of democracy and the institutions of democracy via what I call democratic supplementation. Very important institutional example here might be citizens' assemblies. And these can be problematic. They can take different forms. They can have different powers, a complete lack of powers. But democratic regeneration that brings people together at a local level is one of the more important things that we can explore as a way of trying to keep our democracies afloat. And I think that there's a lot that folks coming from different proper left traditions can contribute to this. And this starts locally, not just in the sense of local politics, in the sense of local anything. This can start in the workplace. This can start in the street, in the building in which you live. It can be about, forms of organization that are directed at national politics. But it can also be about forms of organization that are directed just exclusively to local issues. So, the regeneration of democracy at a local level is something that I think folks coming from your tradition have an enormous amount to, say about, to contribute. And this is genuinely a realistic enterprise. What we're talking about is not sort of fantasy world. It's utterly real. We need to reinvigorate our democratic institutions by supplementing them at a local level, often with practices and ways of organizing we haven't properly tried. The next buzzword is democratization of the economy. How do you bring it about that humans in our societies have more of a say than they do over the distribution of economic resources? What can we do about this? How do we talk about this? I think this is an absolutely central cause for anybody of socialist tradition. It's a very, very important conversation to have. And again, it's a conversation that can start locally, can start in the workplace, can start with local political organization. And, if you do not have any access to national politics, you can't vote for a properly left political party in your country, let's say. And what you can do is think of pockets of proper left political organizations, kind of workshops of ideas, which you then hope to show to be very practical and useful for mainstream parties to deploy. You basically say to future Kamala Harris says, do you want to lose as humiliatingly as you just did to Trump? And as, I don't want to say deservingly, because of course the Democrats profoundly deserved to lose, deserved to be obliterated politically in this election. But if I were a US citizen, I would have crawled to make sure I voted for them against Trump. Both things are true. But you really had, and this is not Kamala Harris's personal fault, she did her very best, but you had a spectacular disconnect from the country, a spectacular incapacity to engage with the interests of working Americans, a spectacular incapacity to offer a picture of a future that made sense, that was in some ways liberatory and so on. So, a lot of what left thought can do is be a workshop for what parties with bigger access to central democratic institutions can implement. So, and then the biggest piece of advice overall is just be bold and love. One last thing, I think, just about the climate. I am behind with 743 things, but one of them is something I've mentioned, which is a co-written piece intentionally with somebody I disagree about on some important issues about climate, about pluralism in the climate movement. I think that's very important too. And so I think what somebody coming from your tradition can do is fight for openness and inclusiveness in the climate movement in a way that I hope to talk about a little bit more in the future. Final remark about me, just to be transparent and indulgent. I don't think my relationship with systemic disadvantage is quite Orwell's, actually. It's not about looking at something and being viscerally struck by it on a social scale. My relationship is quite individual. So when I talk about structural disadvantage, my way into it is to deeply feel what a particular individual, a particular concrete individual in that situation is experiencing, and then to multiply that by numbers, right? So Sally has a chronic illness. Sally has no medical care. Sally is discriminated against by the medical system or whatever. Oh my God, that is so profoundly shocking in these 17 ways. And then let's go and check how many Sallys there are, right? Bobby is profoundly deprioritized economically in these 17 ways. That's exactly how it feels. And having grasped that, then we multiply how many Bobbies are there. So that's, if you like, a quite individualistic approach to relating to structural disadvantage, which I think shows that the way I get to policy positions of mine that might be left isn't through any left tradition, and isn't even through that sort of visceral social response of Orwell. And of course, I must say that the two threads in my own constitution ideologically are, one, realism, and this is not the realism in international relations. This is realism to do with being serious about the core materials of politics, being serious about the core materials of power, right? And this I inherit from Thucydides to Hobbes to Machiavelli. And then I do have a lot of immersion in various liberal traditions. So, for instance, even though I regard Marx as a greater genius than John Stuart Mill, I probably spend 8 times the amount of time thinking about something Mill thought or wrote than about Marx. So that's a snippet about me. If you've survived this, my love, and Fran, thank you.